Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mai haere mai. Welcome to this extraordinary meeting of Nelson City Council on Thursday the 24th of May, and I'll invite you to all stand for the opening prayer.
Almighty God, sovereign in all time, all things, bless the city and its people. Guide us in local government each day, that our decisions may be wise and just, and magnify your holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Councillor Delberg. Morning, councillors. Welcome to this meeting. Today we have apologies from Councillor Noonan and Councillor Ackland. Any other apologies? Or I think we've got everyone here. Thank you, Councillor Barker. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Delberg. Any questions or debate? In that case, I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Now, just in terms of our meeting today, as normal procedure, it is being live streamed. And I'll just remind you to use your microphones, and when you finish speaking, if you could turn them off. For people that are coming to speak at the public forum and during our meeting, the same procedure, there's a button there, the red light will come on, and when that's on, then the microphone is working, and then when you finish, you can just turn it off. We have a public forum this morning that has come after the agenda was issued, and I have Mr. Martin Rodd, the Director of Partnerships from the Department of Conservation, who wishes to speak to us with regard to the funding reduction for Natureland and its impact, and he'll be accompanied by Mr. Devon McLean, who's a trustee of Project Yanzoon, and possibly other titles as well, which he can run through. So I'll invite Devon and Martin to join the meeting. Thank you.
And
noted.
Madam Mayor, I'll leave.
Thank you. Welcome. Hello Martin, hello Devon, welcome to the meeting. It's your opportunity to present to Council. There may be, and I'll leave opportunity for questions at the end. Thank you.
Whaia Rachel, tēnā koe, rangatira Pat, tēnā koe, rau rangatira ma, tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for the opportunity to take just 5 minutes, I guess, to put some context around actually what's going on in terms of the big picture of conservation in the top of the south and how Natureland fits into that. And Devon and I were just having a conversation then that we realised we really haven't spoken too much about what is going on in the top of the south. And so I'll just take a few minutes just to explain that and then come down to the discussion around Natureland. So first of all, so my role is to identify those places in New Zealand that the Department of Conservation should invest in landscape scale conservation. By landscape scale conservation, I'm talking about projects like the full restoration of Abel Tasman National Park, which is clearly a partnership that we've got with Project Yanzoon Trust. And so in order to do that, what I was asked to do was come up with the principles that would guide the Department of Conservation in its work. In the slides that you see up here, I've just got 2 slides that I wanted to talk to. So the first one is the national slide about the principles. I'll talk through those very, very quickly. And then the second one is what it means for us here in the top of the south. So what we've done is we've got these 5 principles. And if I just talk through them very, very quickly. So the very first principle that guides us where we should work, a bit closer, thank you. The very first principle that guides where we should work is around the biodiversity significance of a proposed site. Now what we've done across the top of the south is looked at the values that we have, and it's probably not a surprise, but the top of the south is very, very high in its biodiversity values, so it does pretty well in that space. The second principle, if you're going to work on a landscape scale project, who are the partners that you would look to work with? So partner readiness is really important. So the first partner is iwi, the second partner is local government. And are we ready in the top of the south? Well, last year we signed an MOU between councillors from Bulla all the way through, actually Cockholder's just considering it at the moment, and a number of iwi in the top of the south, and including Ngāi Tahu, which is this is an agreement that talks about how we will work as an alliance using the strengths of each entity to achieve conservation on a landscape scale. So partner readiness, we do pretty well. And what I should also say there in terms of how I spoke to the top of the south, I use Nelson Nature as an example. Here's a clear example of a council that's already leading in this space. How do we support them to do more? Principle 3 is around the alignment with other programs, and we're very conscious that there are many large programs that offer the opportunity for alignment. We've currently got Pretty the Free 2050 Limited, and we'll be hearing more about that obviously in the weeks ahead. We've got 1 billion trees through the Provincial Growth Fund. We've got the Ministry for the Environment's Freshwater Improvement Fund. These are all examples of these large projects that we can align with, and we've got examples of where they are applying here and where we hope to apply them. The fourth one is hearts and minds. And so we can achieve conservation outcomes in some of the most remote places in New Zealand that are outstanding, such as the Antipodes Islands, the $1 Million Mouse. That's fantastic. Who's been to the Antipodes? Not very many people. Some lucky people have. And so the point I was making around the top of the south is actually we've got an extraordinary success story in terms of the Brockway Marama Sanctuary. So a community came together and has achieved the predator-proof fencing of 700 hectares, so a sanctuary right on the edge of town. We've also got so many community groups working in around this place that it's very, very clear to see that community conservation is a very powerful part of who we are as a region. Does pretty well in that space. And the last one, which is slid off the slide there, is about the likelihood of success. And actually we have a number of really good success stories. But if I just go into the next one, so let's just have a quick look about what those success stories are. So this map here shows the work of the Alliance. I referred to that MOU. That MOU is referred to as Kotahitanga Moti Taio, so it's coming together as one in terms of how we work with the environment. Each of those colours on that map represent a project that we're currently working on. Clearly, Project Yarnzoon was an initiator. You can see the scale of Nelson Nature shown in red there. Those are all really significant catalyst projects that have enabled us to talk about what the potential is across the whole top of the south. So I've got a dedicated team working on that now. And I won't go into the detail, but all of those projects that are under some kind of colour coding up there are currently being worked on. And so what's the relevance for Natureland? How does Natureland fit into something when you're looking at more than 2 million hectares? Well, I think, first of all, what Natureland does, and it does very well, and I have to recognise the current curator, Meg, has an incredible passion for what she does. And so when they first arrived, we went to meet with Meg to understand what she was about. And she's got a vision for Natureland that takes it well beyond what you would refer to as a zoo. And so her ability to advocate for nature and connecting nature to people is very, very strong, and she's very skilled at it and has good credibility for doing so. The second thing that Natureland does, which is a big gap, so for those of you that knew the vet, Mana Stratton, so Mana used to provide an amazing service of wildlife recovery. And so for the wildlife that gets injured just in everyday activities around our region, we used to take them to Mana and she would help them on their road to recovery. So that's no longer an option. Natureland provides that, and it's amazing just how much that means to people. I was biking home and there was a shag walking down Haven Road, and cars were kind of going everywhere because it's right in the middle of the road. And so I jumped off my bike and picked up the shag, and clearly biking with a shag's pretty hard. So there was a woman, and she was a lot older than me, and she pulled over and she said, "Can I help? And I said, "Well, I'd like to, this bird's been injured, I'd like to get it through to Natureland." She said, "I'll take it." And I said, "Well, you do realise if you put it in your car, it's going to make quite a mess." And she said, "No, I've got a blanket." She wrapped it up, and she was so proud to take that bird on its way. And I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. So we've got quite a special link, I think, in this region with nature. And the third point that I'll talk about just very briefly and then hand over to Devon is that Natureland's moving into a space of breeding species, threatened species in captivity. And so if we look over on that map there, the work that's been undertaken, so take Abel Tasman as an example, the extensive predator control that's underway in that area has enabled birds that have once been lost, or other species once been lost to that area through predation, to be reintroduced. Now, it's a really expensive process to reintroduce species. We've got a number of facilities around New Zealand. Having the ability to access that right in Nelson is pretty special. And so that'll do for me, but I thought what I'd do is let Devon talk about that, because it's particularly close to that. So should I take any questions there, or hand over to Devon?
Look, I'm happy to take a couple of questions now, if you like, and then we'll continue with Devon, but we can come back if there's any more. Councillor Laurie and Councillor Full.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Martin. My first question is, who from Council asked you to come and talk to us today and advocate for Natureland?
I got a call on Friday from Meg herself. And so Meg phoned me. I was in Wellington, took the call, and she said, I've just had this news that our funding has been reduced, I believe she said, to 170k after 12 months. And I said, so talk to me about the implications of that. And she said, so what that means for me is that by reducing funding in year 2, I have to start a strategy of closing Natureland in terms of the animal welfare. I have to start rehoming them. She was quite upset. And I said, well, I don't have any understanding of what's going on here. Can we just talk this through? And so that's when I contacted the Mayor, and just to say, can you give me some context? I'm at a loss as to what's going on here.
Okay. Next question through the Chair. Couldn't you take an injured bird to the wonderful sanctuary that we've got in the Brook?
In years to come, possibly. I think that the Brook and Natureland are very complementary rather than competitive. I have heard the tension between the two. In order to look after injured wildlife, you have to have the necessary skills to do that. Duplicating them at the Brook, well, it could be an option, but when you've got the facilities directly in Natureland where people can also come and be a part of that experience of recovery, currently it's pretty good.
And final question through the Chair, if that's okay. Traditionally, DOC does breeding programs.
Yep.
One of the things that people get very sort of uncomfortable about is when central government gets local government to do things that central government used to do.
Yep.
And that kind of feels like what's happening today. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, what I'd say is that I've been working in conservation for about 25 years, and I guess the last 20 years or so we've been very much focused on we know best and we'll just get on and do it. But what we've seen in the last 5 years where others get involved and we use our expertise to enable others to be successful, we're getting far greater gains. And so what I've done in this instance is I've invested a dedicated team to think about how we can grow the success of working with others, and did it instead of doing the actual conservation work to see whether I can get others on board to be successful. And that's what that map looks like. Depending on time, I could give you several really cool stories in terms of how that's worked. I'm very happy to do that. So I guess where this started for me was when I was area manager in Motueka, and I was responsible for 220,000 hectares. I had a budget of $2 million and I had a staff of 30. And I had to work in those places which are recognised nationally for their significance. One of those areas was the Waimea Estuary, 3,500 hectares. I administered 2% of that estuary. So I had no ability to just go in there and start managing like you would say a national park where you've got full authority. And so I asked one of our rangers to go and just connect with the community around the estuary, learn what their motivations were, what was driving them to do work there, and look how we could help them to be more successful. That ended up supporting a project called the Battle for the Banded Rail, which saw in excess of 200 volunteers connecting to that estuary. They've just planted their 20,000th tree, and they've just done an amazing job of trapping with philanthropic support. So for my staff of 30, one person multiplied an effort to 200. And one thing I'll just add to that, I went along to one of the planting days. We're planting the riparian margins. And now if I'd gone out there and been planting these riparian margins, I would have had the margin to plant. But when the farmer saw that it was a community coming out, they said, oh, hang on a minute, I'll move my fence back at my cost so you can have a 30-metre strip. I guarantee if I tried to negotiate that, I would have had to pay for that. And if I managed to negotiate the fence, there's something magical about community involvement that's going to grow conservation far more than we can grow it alone.
Thanks, Martin. I've got some other questions, but I think I'll go to Devon and then we'll get all the questions at the end.
Thank you, Mayor Rachel. Good morning, everybody. This is probably the first time my family, who arrived in Nelson in 1842, have spoken to the Nelson Council. I don't have any other record of it, so it's interesting to have that opportunity. I will focus really on the task in hand, which is around the implications for Project Janzoon. So hopefully all of you are aware that there's a project underway there now into its 6th year in the Abel Tasman, privately funded in terms of most of its restoration work. We've invested about $10 million so far, and we've got about as far to go again in terms of change we want to make in that place. And those of you who've been in the park recently will have seen a lot of dead trees. We now have eliminated all the wilding conifers from the park. We're busy working on 113 other weed species that are present in the park, and they're coming under control now. We've got 20,000 hectares of stoat control and rat and possum control through that park, and we're starting to see the benefits. These things don't happen instantly, but we're starting to see the changes. The species composition of that park was relatively low because of the history of it. A lot has been farmed and logged, and as you're probably well aware, it's on very poor soils, which is why the farming failed in that area. And so things happen relatively slowly in terms of restoration work. So in addition to securing the park against the problems, we've now started focusing on how do we help restore. And a lot of that's about reintroducing species. So in the last 5 years, we've introduced kakariki in small numbers, a handful of kaka, saddleback onto the islands, onto Adele, recently Partiki into the Awaroa estuary, and there are other restoration processes planned. One of the problems with the species work is, in most cases, you can't go to the supermarket and buy them off the shelf. It's actually curious with Partiki, with brown teal you just about can because they're farmed essentially now. But for a species like kaka, and particularly a species where there's a differential in terms of the genetics and so on, so you actually need to source your birds from the top of the south to grow the population, it's quite challenging. Department of Conservation and others have developed some pretty smart methods for collecting or for tracking birds, firstly, finding that they're nesting, protecting those nest sites, taking eggs at an early stage, and usually in a beach mast condition, those birds will lay a second clutch of eggs if the first is taken, and the opportunity there is to incubate those eggs and then to raise the fledglings and transfer them back to the park. And we've been working on a plan for kaka, for Northwest Nelson kaka, to do exactly that over the next couple of years. A critical part of that process is the facilities that are capable of incubating and husbanding the young birds through that process. And so our interest and concern around the Natureland situation is that they are one of the key players. They are the closest. They have the expertise. The nearest otherwise will be in Christchurch or at maybe Mount Bruce, where we'll be moving eggs to and shifting birds around. And beyond that, I guess we're interested in their ability to be an advocate for the work that's happening in conservation around the area. So they have facilities down there, some of which we've paid for, to support yellow-crowned kakariki and others, and they tell the story of Project Janzoon and the work that we're doing in the park. So that's our interest, and we would be delighted to see the council support Natureland, at least for a bit longer, to get the opportunity to transition to a different base. If this project goes ahead as we're planned, we will be investing in new aviaries and upgrading their incubation facilities, but we need their expertise. Thank you.
Thank you, Devon. I've got some questions, so we'll go to Councillor Fulton, then I've got Councillor Delberg, and then I've got Councillor Courtney.
Thank you very much for speaking to us today. My question is, how much funding does DOC and Project Janzoon provide to Natureland each year currently?
We don't have a running amount to them. We invest in particular things. So when we needed new aviaries, we paid for the cost of that. In the case of the work on the kaka, what's planned is firstly that there is some new investment in incubation and aviary facilities, but also we'll support the cost of the staff that are involved in the the incubation and the husbandry of the young birds. So it's not an annual fee, if you like, to Natureland. It's specific to task.
So effectively, they're delivering a contract, you're contracting them to deliver a service back to you?
In part, that's true, yeah. In part, it's a broader support. The aviaries are used for other than just our birds, but it's part of our encouragement for having that capability available.
And from DOC's point of view, we've supported Natureland with the necessary authorisations to do the work that they do. So we don't fund them directly. We give them, for example, if you're going to handle threatened species, you have to be authorised for that. It's quite a process. So we've basically worked through that process with them.
So DOC doesn't currently fund the wildlife recovery project?
No, we don't.
Why not?
Typically, the wildlife recovery work that's been done across New Zealand is done through this capacity.
Done through?
Capacity of volunteers. For example, Mana Stratton did it for many years in this area as a volunteer.
This isn't a volunteer, this is a commercial entity. So why would DOC not invest in a commercial entity in terms of...
Sorry to interrupt, Councillor Fulton, but I think, because I think it's important that we don't have incorrect information in the meeting, I'm reasonably sure that Natureland is a trust. Will somebody just confirm that for me? It's a trust.
It's a trust.
An officer, Roger? It's not a commercial entity, is it a charitable trust?
Apologies. It's a charitable trust. But
Well, no, I'm not sure if it's a charitable trust, I just know that it's a not-for-profit trust and it may be charitable, and somebody could just check that perhaps.
I didn't mean to say, apologies, I didn't mean to say it was profiting, but it does operate as a commercial business, and so it has to receive funding from various funding partners, and I guess I'm surprised that if we're aware of what great work it does with its wildlife recovery, DOC...
I'm sorry, Councillor Fulton, I'm just going to interrupt again because it's not a commercial business. I'm sorry, I'm just checked with the Chief Executive. If something is deemed to be a trust, it is not a commercial business. It's important that it's not, we don't have incorrect information being put out into the public.
Apologies. So my next question is, if Natureland only operated on its breed for release programs, my understanding was through our recent report that they can only do 3 breeds at a time, and so they're quite limited in their capacity to grow that. If they were to focus their efforts on that, which is one of the reasons why Natureland remained open, what kind of funding do you think they would require just to do breed for release?
Depends on the species.
Subsequent question, would DOC be willing to help fund that kind of program?
Totally depend on the species. So, for example, so we've got 4,000 threatened species in New Zealand, and some of those species are categorised very, very highly. Those do have specific breeding programs. We have facilities around New Zealand that work with those. If Natureland was to move into the space where they could work with some of those species, then absolutely we'd have the conversation. You talked about wildlife recovery. It's from many species that are well down that list. We with 4,000 species critical across New Zealand, we need to prioritise. It is like I said before, it's a strong community service that they do deliver by helping injured birds that wouldn't actually categorise themselves very highly across those 4,000 threatened species.
And final question through the chair, are you aware that the Brook Sanctuary also does amazing work in terms of biodiversity, and that they receive significantly less funding than Natureland currently?
Yes, we've worked very closely with the Sanctuary. We've obviously directed quite a lot of funding ourselves to them, both direct through the DOC Community Fund and also through direct in-kind support to enable them to be successful. I also network through philanthropy to ensure that I have the opportunity to connect the Brook to philanthropists. It's a very important part. It's just a really good point. So we've hosted a number of key philanthropists in this region, and I've taken them through to the Brook. I've taken them to the Able Tasman. I've talked about NAS and nature. I've done this presentation before. You never quite know where you get the hook, but we certainly have success around the Brook.
Councillor Fulton, I'm just checking, I was just concerned there was some other information that may not be quite accurate either, just in terms of the current funding I don't know, Mr.
Apologies, I meant the future funding. I think the future funding for the Brook Sanctuary is 150,000 per year.
Yeah, I think the current funding's pretty much the same. Councillor Delberg.
Thanks, Madam Chair. No, I think mine been partly answered about the wildlife recovery and Mana's good work there and how the Natureland is helping to complement. I think you've answered that for me. No funding, it's volunteer work.
Correct.
Thank you. Councillor Courtney.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to our submitters. Thank you, gentlemen, for what you're doing in the community. Absolutely so valuable and appreciated by us all around the table here, and I think the Nelson community widely too. I have to pick up, Martin, a point you made, and I really do want you to develop this because it concerns me. And you said that you were aware of the tensions. You said the tensions between the Brook Waimarama Sanctuary and Natureland, and I'd like you to expand on that, please.
Thanks for picking up on that. If I could just wind back just one level and then come back to that specific question. So the work with Kautahitanga that we're currently doing is to create a strategy as to how we work between local government and iwi and DOC to achieve landscape scale conservation across the top of the south. And in those discussions, what I've found as I've moved around the regions, I'll just give you a tourism example and then I'll come back to your specific one. And so there was a tourism discussion, which was, I'm careful what I say, but there was a tourism discussion in one region that was in Nelson that was their strategy was to see how they could capitalise on pulling tourists out of Nelson. And I look at that and think, how are we going to work as one region if effectively we're trying to capitalise or cannibalise off one another? What would it look like if we collectively had a strategy for an integrated strategy between local government, DOC and iwi, how visitors flow through this area? That's the type of thing what we're working towards. In my work with the Brook and in terms of Natureland, there is discussion around the future of captive breeding. And ultimately, the Brook would like to go into that space. We know that for sure. They've got a little way to go. They've done an amazing job getting to where they are now. It is a bit of a waiting game to see whether the eradication has been successful. Ultimately, if we're successful in terms of what's on their map, it's the opportunity for captive breeding and release will be huge.
Elaborate on tensions. It's all around the breeding, is it?
So the tension is around the breeding.
Yeah, fine. Can I just have another follow-up to Devon? Devon, we're guardians of the ratepayers' purse. You'd understand that because you pay rates. Your family has since 1842, so you'd know all about that. But are you aware that we already are committed to giving 2.5 million to Natureland over the next 10 years, and that up until now we've given 1.9 million to the Brook Waimarama Sanctuary? Are you aware of those figures, particularly the Natureland one?
I'm not specifically aware of the figures, as I've seen what's been proposed in the long-term plan, and obviously there's a history to that. And I think that's fantastic that investment's been made. And I guess what we're trying to do is, in part, is capitalise on that at scale. And I think it's worth noting that the work that the component of the task of, say, restoring Kaka to the able Tasman that Natureland is able to do is relatively small and relatively cheap if you compare it to the cost of 20,000 hectares of stoat and rat control, the cost of monitoring those birds for years once we put them back in the field to make sure they're breeding successfully, the cost of aviaries which we have in the park for release sites for those birds so they can be transferred effectively into the park. So we're asking for a small contribution, and it's just having that expertise there. We couldn't afford to have that level of expertise there for the work we're doing. It's there because they're working on a number of things, and we're using a component of that, and I guess that's all we're asking for.
Just a quick follow-up. You are aware, yes, that we've already committed ourselves for 248,000 next year and 170 after that, and you're wanting us to increase that. That's what you're here today, to ask for a certain figure?
No, I'm not asking you to increase the 248. I'm concerned that the implications of the fall-off in the following year may cause Natureland to take actions that will remove or reduce their capacity to support what we're trying to do.
Thank you. I've got some other speakers, but Martin, Devon, I just wonder if you could just focus on the question that just came from Councillor Courtney. So, Martin, you know, when you contacted me, you really felt that your reason for being so concerned was that you were concerned that it was essentially triggering a wind down.
A wind down.
So can you
Yeah, that's
explain
correct.
perhaps to us what you mean by that?
Well, I guess when it comes to biodiversity and working with nature, you can't do things quickly. And so, like, I fully understand after years of managing budgets just how hard it is. What I would say is, if there is the ability to sustain the funding for Natureland at a level that makes them sustainable, that gives them sufficient time to think about a new business strategy, say over 3 years, then that puts them in a position where actually they can start to plan. My concern after talking to Meg, that if you say, actually, no, we're going to cut down to a level that isn't sustainable, then in that role, the accountability of animal welfare, it literally, as I understand it, forces them into a wind down. Whereas, say, for example, 3 years would give them a chance to rethink their business strategy.
So as you, and this is what I'm just trying to understand, because I didn't fully grasp that. So,
Yeah.
and when you've communicated with me and I wasn't quite following that. So,
Yeah.
So, and you've talked about animals having to be rehomed, or I suppose if they're not able to be rehomed, there's probably a worse outcome for them. But,
Yeah, that's right.
But is that something to do with the processes where you accredit Natureland for particular activities, or is it, I'm just wondering, is it around the animal welfare? I don't quite...
It is around the animal welfare, so, but basically what I asked Meg to explain to me, well, what were the implications? And she said, well, look, so many of the animals that we have, it's not like you can just hand them out to people to look after. You've got to find someone that has the facilities to look after those animals. Then if they've got the facilities, they've got the capacity. And if they don't, well, as you say, then you've got to think about what the other options are for those animals.
Councillor Laurie and then Councillor McGurk.
Sorry, just through the chair, would you mind repeating that last bit? You were saying the animals, were you talking about the meerkats and the monkeys?
Yeah, well, the animals that aren't common, absolutely. So there's a number of species in there. So, yeah, so what do you do with those to ensure that they are looked after long term? If you're going to close that facility, where do they go?
Okay, so my question through the chair is, I mean, you know how they operate at Natureland. I would have thought if they spent less money on monkeys and meerkats, they'd have more money to spend on kaka and kakariki. Don't you think?
Well, that's a really good conversation to have with Natureland in terms of their strategy. And that's what I'm saying, if you gave them, if it was possible to give them more time to have that conversation, that's exactly what they'd have. But if you immediately go to them, okay, 12 months and then you're into this new strategy of reduced funding, it doesn't give them much time. I think
sometime. Through the chair, one other question, just reflecting on the earlier conversation, the Mayor's conversation about the communication between you and the council. When you were speaking through the chair to the Mayor, did she ask you to come and present here today?
I offered to. And the reason I offered to come and talk here was because that context that I tried to go through here on the screen was missing. So I've emailed and I said, okay, so what are the options here? And this was one of the options. And I said, look, I'll be very happy to come along. Because what I'm conscious of is that the two sites I went through is there's not a lot known about that particular story in terms of where we're heading as a region. And I just wanted to take the time to share that and put it in the context of how Natureland can play a role in that.
Can play a role. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Now, I've got a few more questions, but I'm going to just wrap it up fairly soon because this has been a very long public forum. And what I'm going to suggest, if you don't manage to get on my list, because I'm not going to go a second time round, Martin, are you happy to take questions? We can send the questions through to you and we can get the answers back. Is that all right? Because I'm conscious I've got another matter here that's sort of
Yeah, absolutely.
to move forward. All right, so I'd like to take a couple more people that haven't spoken already. Councillor McGurk and Councillor Skinner. If I can fit it in, Councillor Barker, I'll fit you in too.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor, and through you. Questions, the 2018 budget was quite good for conservation, not as good as probably could have been as you wanted, because I think I'm just looking at your website here and it's gone from about 350 million to 400, up to 450 million.
13% increase.
Yeah. 181 million. Yeah, $181 million over 4 years. A big part of that seems to be biodiversity contingency. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so first of all, there's a really significant part of it which is increasing our ability to do landscape predator control across New Zealand. So that's tagged, and you would have noticed that that 80 million over 4 years, the 76 million contingency enables us to look at the 4,000 threatened species and think about, okay, so with this new money, how would we invest in that? So it's a really powerful budget to have. It gives you a completely different lens in terms of how you can look at some of the threatened species work that's required.
Okay. Because I see it's scaled up, I think it's $17 million this year, or from 1 July, and then I think it goes up to around about, was it?
Well, basically got 9 million this year and 20 million next year, and then it scales up from here.
20 million there, yeah, 30. So it's quite a sizable chunk of money.
It's significant.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Is that the sort of money that could be put into Natureland, Martin?
No.
I wonder if that's what the purpose of the question for Councillor, was that the purpose of your question, Councillor McGurk?
No, there's the line item, looking at the line items that the DOC had at their operational budget, they've had nothing for biodiversity contingency in previous years. They've got a big injection of money. I would imagine that a new scope of work like that's going to take some time to scale up. So I can't expect Mr. Rod to answer the question how they're going, what they're planning to do with that.
It's actually a really interesting question. So my colleagues around New Zealand are being asked that right now. Excellent, Doc, you've got this new money. Come and talk to us. Pretty much every office. 4,000 threatened species will be the focus of that day.
So Martin, would any of that money end up going to an organisation like Natureland?
Well, if I go back to what I said before about the opportunity to collaborate, absolutely, in terms of looking for those opportunities. And so if we had a threatened species focus and we look at what the best opportunities to progress those, and if someone like Natureland had the ability to work with that, that may be a conversation we could have. Yeah. But what I should say is that there are 4,000 threatened species. The job is huge.
Councillor, who did I have next? Councillor Skinner.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Martin and Devon. We had a report commissioned in regards to Natureland from Mr. David Haven on what they're doing or potentially doing in their vision, and it was pointed out in that that Natureland were intending to work with DOC and especially the Care Conservation Trust, and then there was a comment here from Natureland that DOC may be withdrawing from the Care Conservation Program. Is that why is that? Why is DOC withdrawing from that? If it's
I'll find out the details in terms of what's going on with the Care program. I don't have that with me.
okay. The other thing was, do you realise with the funding for Natureland originally in our annual plan prior and the LTP prior to this LTP, there wasn't any funding allocated. It was to the end of this year. So the funding that is going into this year, which however much or little it is, that is new funding. We're aware that funding wasn't ever promised originally.
What I'm aware of is only what's in the long-term plan.
The other question on that, with the cutting back on that and the importance that you're pointing out with the funding for Natureland and for yourselves, was there a reason why you didn't submit to the LTP the plan to put that to us? Because this is new money, this is complete, there was no funding after this year to stop, or we decide if we're going to give any or all. So that would have been quite important for you, quite important for Natureland and your partnership. Would that not have been?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I was reflecting on that, and I'll take that as a learning, and it did come as a surprise. I wasn't expecting it, and so I had made the assumption that the support for biodiversity is so strong in this council. I just did not see that coming. To be honest, I didn't see it coming.
Okay, because we support a lot of things, but obviously we can't support everything. And breeding, the other part of it, breeding, and you talk about breeding of endangered birds, etc.
Yeah.
That was not part of discussion or plans for Natureland from the City Council objectives. That is an objective of Natureland, which is all very good. So if that was something that you were keen to start or begin with, would that not have been an important thing to come to us, say, hey, we want to add a new objective to the Natureland Zoo, can you please fund us? Because we aren't able to.
Yeah, so that, actually, did you want to comment on that one in terms of your relationship with Natureland and how that's been worked out in terms of species recovery?
I guess the point I would make is that really this is in the last weeks the first time I've been aware that this funding was at risk. So we had perhaps naively assumed that we could continue to have that capacity there and work with them to invest in new facilities to help with the program. So I didn't have that information to hand.
Thank you. So just in summary there wasn't a funding at risk, there wasn't a funding. So really the funding we've put in or decided in long-term plan is new funding, and which is a different perspective that you're bringing to the table, that there's a cut in funding. We as a council table, I can talk on my own behalf, this is whatever we gave as new funding over and above what was originally intended from previous plans or discussions or objectives or what was in here.
So I think Councillor Skinner, essentially a long-term plan is the new plan. So that is the plan. So the public see what we put out as the draft. They don't see all the other pieces that we deal with in the background bringing it out. So that's what the public submitted. Councillor Barker.
Important, Madam Mayor, that people understood that this is not a cutting in funding. This is, we're already giving a 170k or 250k, 170k plus 50k capital. That is new funding to what was existing there to achieve new objectives or retain what objectives they're achieving. So I think there was a bit of a miscommunication.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just one very basic question to Martin and Devon. Will this reduction in the funding in the second year and onwards negatively impact on Natureland's ability to leverage funding from organisations like your own?
Just the microphone, Martin, thank you. It's all right.
If the reduction in funding results in Natureland winding down, then their strategy will be winding down. And so, I mean, I'm conscious that you're holding reports that I don't have. If you hold reports that identify that the funding is sustainable for Natureland, I'd welcome to see those. I'm here to talk about the wider context with the information that I have, but happy to view those.
Evan?
Yeah, just quickly, from my perspective, if the change in funding resulted in loss of capacity of specialist expertise in the looking at the raising and looking after of those birds, then yes, it would have implications for us in terms of putting funding in there.
There's several more questions out there, but I'm going to wrap this up now. And so, councillors, if you've got additional questions, if you could perhaps just feed them through to the governance advisors, and then, are you happy with that, Robin? Sure. And then I'm sure that Devon and Martin will be happy to provide some answers. Look, I thank you both for coming in, and yes, long-term plans are sometimes very fickle things, and you can be expecting that there's certainly a good signal around biodiversity, but change can happen. So I think a learning for all of us that you've got to keep engaged with us right through the process if we've got a funding source or an entity that's important to you. Look, thank you very much for both coming in today, and just reinforce the incredibly positive contribution that the alliance between organisations has in the top of the South Island, and Devon, the success of Project Yanzoon is a fantastic example of what can happen when a region decides it really wants to step up on biodiversity, and you can attract other funding. Because I'm conscious that, it's I think around about $10 million that hopefully I've got that about right, that's come in to support those biodiversity efforts across Abel Tasman. And Martin, I'm really looking forward to us hopefully being able to progress this, doing some more and more work on the building the alliance, and the potential, as you've identified for me previously, of actually now attracting, if we get that collegiality, we get that partnership, we get the good science and the community buy-in, then potentially there's some significant international funds that could be coming to the top of the South Island, really putting us on the map. So thank you very much for coming in.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Now, Council, so just if you had those questions, please just send them through. If you could maybe do that by the end of the week too, Robin, that would be great, with the governance advisors. Now, next on our agenda, we're just on our public agenda. Perhaps if somebody could go and locate councillor Rutledge, because I think he can come back to the meeting. I thank you, Alec, that would be good. And, oh no, that's the sports and rec agenda, I don't want that one. I want this one over here, this one, right. So we now, the item that we need to deal with today is an item in relation to the Te Hunanui, the Te Hunanui Beach Holiday Park, and that's a matter that we are going to address in public excluded business for the reasons of legal professional privilege and to enable the local authority to carry on without prejudice or disadvantage negotiations, including commercial and industrial negotiations. So they're the relevant sections of the Act. Now, we do wish to have some people stay with us in public excluded for the reasons that Mr. Gary Ward, June Isles, Ian Allport, Keith Swift and Eric Davey from the Te Huna Beach Camp Society remain after the public has been excluded in relation to the item, as they have knowledge that will assist the council, and we would need to move the recommendation, or move the motion to allow them to remain, and through that to address that item, and that's in accordance with sections 48.5 and 48.6 of the Local Government Official Information and Meetings Act. Now, I'll just check with Robin, there's probably a little bit more to that. Is that in entirety what's here, or do I need the other piece as well, Robin? Right, okay.
And then you've got...
Okay, so,
PE.
and then we go on to PE. So the first one we're going to do is to confirm that they can stay. Thank you, Councillor Courtney. I've just got some advice from the Chief Executive. Hang on a moment.
There's 7 of them sitting up there, including the 7 motion.
Yes, I'll just double check. I don't think, it is, I've got the right names, haven't I, here? Because Stephen, you're not going to stay and someone else is not going to stay. So no, I think I'm correct. That's quite, oh God. All right, it's been moved by Councillor Courtney, and do I have a seconder in terms of allowing people to stay? I'll now deal with it. It's been seconded by the Deputy Mayor, thank you. I'll now put the motion. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Now we do the resolution to exclude the public, and I've given you the reasons already, so I'll now ask that somebody moves that we exclude the public. Thank you. Moved by Councillor Barker. I'll second that. I'll put the motion. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. So that takes us into public excluded business. And we'll just